In the early 19th century, Napoleon was at the peak of his success. He had most of Europe under his control in one way or another, and decided to tackle Europe's final frontier, Russia. Napoleon went in with over 500,000 soldiers. He and his army plunged deep into the heart of Russian territory and were living off land due to a failed supply chain. They quickly made it to Moscow. He then issued a surrender request to Tsar Alexander of Russia, which went unanswered. Then, as winter struck, Napoleon realized he had to get out of Russia as fast as possible to avoid the cold, icy death that is the Russian winter. He tried his best to escape with as many people as possible, but it proved unsuccessful, with the weather withering down their numbers until only a fifth of the troops remained. Napoleon escaped Russia on his own, fearing unrest in Paris and leaving 100,000 men behind. This invasion had a large, lasting effect, not just on Napoleon's army, but on Russia as a whole. Today you're about to see why Napoleon's Russian campaign had severe cultural and political significance and changed Europe forever. Additionally, during the Russian campaign, a lot of damage was done to Russia. The Russians, while retreating, had a scorched earth policy. They burnt down everything Napoleon's army could use for sustenance and cut their supply lines off. This led to a lot of Russia becoming harsh and desolate, likely making rebuilding efforts in the path of his army inconvenient and dangerous. During the campaign, Moscow, one of Russia's most prized cities, was burned down by Count Rostopchin before they fled. Napoleon and his army. This is a large contributor to Napoleon's failure in 1812, denying him and his troops resources from the city. This led to a hefty rebuilding effort that the Russians desperately did after Napoleon left. Moscow was in a destroyed state for quite a while, but eventually rose to become the capital of the Soviet Union on the 5th of March 1918. The population also increased over the years, reaching 21.7 million people by today. After the Russian campaign, a few European countries saw an opening, switching sides to ally against Napoleon, forming a coalition that would eventually annihilate Napoleon's final reserves, putting him on an island and negating his power. This led to a lot of interaction between the French and Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers would sometimes stay at the houses of French people, sometimes for up to 6 weeks, and would get pain and wine or other things. Most troops were allowed to live in apartments in low-level areas, while higher-level troops like officers lived in the finest estates or luxury hotels. The Russians, especially the commanders, were amazed that French, a language that always belonged to only the upper class in Russia, was used by the most lowly commoners in France. In other words, they were amazed that the French spoke French. The Russians also noticed French decorations, like flowers, for the first time. This led them to be exposed to more types of style and likely using different styles themselves. Additionally, many Russian officers learned French, allowing them to live in France without hassle. The Russians who didn't know French listened and were friendly to native French speakers. This led to Russian nobles seeing fancy French decorations and filling their homes with them. These were things like huge mirrors, cushy armchairs, lush sheets, and more. Russian troops and French people were both Christian, but the Russians didn't appreciate French Christianity, as they believed the French acted unfaithful in church, talking, falling asleep, and laughing during the ceremony. But the Russians primarily blamed the French Revolution for this misconduct. Russian troops also found French literature, learning how to read it and learning new ways to write it. This helped to expand Russian writing, influencing them with French writing styles. Russia also tried French cuisine, buying food from bakers and cafes when moving to France. One Russian trooper, Kakovsky, wrote, "They gave us a piece of boiled beef with some nasty Dijon mustard, a piece of duck and an egg each, and for dessert an apple each and some almonds on a plate." All of these cultural interactions and changes to Russia were not the only effect of the failed Russian campaign. The European political scene was also greatly affected by Napoleon's failure. Due to Napoleon's failure and his loss of over 400,000 troops, many countries lost faith in the French Empire.
A good example of this phenomenon would be Prussia, which quickly changed its allegiances and teamed up with Russia. Austria also decided to move against France. These countries started a war with Napoleon, known as the War of the Sixth Coalition. This eventually led to Napoleon being imprisoned on the remote island of Elba, as mentioned earlier. He was crowned Emperor of Elba, which was far worse than Emperor of France, so Napoleon wanted out. And a few months later, he got out. He sailed back to France and began to rule again, as many soldiers on the side of other armies flocked to Napoleon to fight for him. Unfortunately for Napoleon, other countries were gunning to take him down. In the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's failed tactics, poor communication, and mainly being outnumbered over 3-1 led to his defeat, where he was sent to St. Helena to live out the rest of his days. This was the collapse of the French Empire, leading to many countries reverting to their original state outside of French rule, and the end of the Napoleonic era.
The invasion also heavily impacted Europe's economy. With nearly 500,000 soldiers dead, France wasn't doing too well with less jobs, money making, and well, this is likely part of why France banished Napoleon to Elba, because the country wasn't too happy about going into an economic crisis. But this probably helped France in some ways in the long term, increasing trade with Russia and other countries were giving new exposure to France, as mentioned before. This also cost other countries a lot of money. Russia experienced some of what France did, losing tons of people and money during the campaign. Additionally, Napoleon's army was made up of soldiers from other countries, likely costing them manpower as well. The Russian campaign also led to the Battle of Waterloo, which cost the British an estimated 1.6 billion of today's pounds or more. The Russian campaign additionally led to the collapse of Napoleon's empire and the increase of British trade networks, benefiting Britain in the long term, even with the 1.6 billion pound loss. In conclusion, Napoleon's Russian campaign was clearly a major turning point in history, changing not just France and Russia, but all of Europe. It affected economies, costing a lot in the short term and possibly improving trade in the long term. It affected France and Russia the most, with Moscow being burnt down and Napoleon being sent into exile. It also showed other countries, like Russia, more of France, exchanging cultures and traditions in the process.
We are the champions. We are the champions. No time for losers, 'cause we are the champions.